Well, let's see who we have here. A couple numbers I don't recognize. I did hear from Chief Merkel that he's not going to be able to join us today. We don't have either Brian Pete or Mark Anderson yet. A couple of phone numbers I don't recognize.
The 498 call is me.
Okay.
207 is Jack Helm, Helm.
Okay. Thank you, Jack. Good morning.
And I'll be on for a while. I'll have to drop you and then re-pick up. I'm in a vehicle right now.
Yep. Okay. So it looks like we're missing Mark, Brian, and Drew. But in the interest of respecting everybody's time, well, and George, of course, but he told me he wouldn't be here. Yes, I will go ahead and call the meeting to order. And just a reminder, the meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on our resources webpage, which is off the DPS webpage. Everybody okay with the agenda? Anything
Yes.
anything anybody wants to add to the agenda? If not, I'll consider that approved. Has everybody had a chance to, we've kicked down the road for the last few meetings, the approval of the minutes from the first 3 meetings. Anybody that had any corrections they wanted to make, if they had a chance to get them to Mandy, and we okay with approving the minutes from July 27, August 3, and August 10?
I have no issues. I do remember Mark saying that he had some corrections on that, but I don't know what they were.
Yeah, that was, I think that was at least a week ago, if not 2. So I think he's had the opportunity to send Mandy any corrections he wanted to. Could we just go through the formality of having a motion to approve the minutes of those 3 dates?
Yeah, I'll move that we approve.
I'll do a second.
Thank you. Any discussion about minutes? All those in favor of approval, say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Bye.
Anybody opposed? You guys have it. We can take those off our agenda for next week. So we have a special guest this morning. Terry LaValle is with us from somewhere. I didn't ask where, but I know it's not water. Okay. I was going to say probably. Okay. So thank you for joining us, Terry. I had sent Terry a copy of the legislation that created this fine working group and sort of highlighted the areas that we're tasked with reporting on, and sort of asked him to, with that in mind, knowing what our charge is, if he could come talk to us just to talk about whatever he thinks we should know. I think for me personally anyway, the biggest problem is that I don't know yet what I don't know. So I know it's a very broad introduction, Terry, but do you have anywhere you'd like to start with?
Well, I had a conversation with Lance, and I think one of the areas we really wanted to touch on was the capabilities of the state's communication systems. Lance, right. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, specifically what are our weak points, what are our strong points, or specifically our weak points, to be honest with you.
Okay, so for law enforcement on the state's communication systems, specifically that was designed for Vermont State Police, it is a mobile-only system, and it's designated to work within the different troop areas that's been established by the state police. It's a single-channel system per troop area, and those systems are utilized for dispatching law enforcement and the other partners that share the channel with us. It's the coverage of that system across the state is probably around 75%. There's some known areas across the state where we have traditionally had problems communicating. We look to enhance those areas as funding becomes available. But for the most part, it's a fairly effective communications tool for the Vermont State Police. Lance being on the road. And Paul, you also you have firsthand experience, obviously, with the capabilities of the system. In
Are
addition,
those,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, are those the 25%, you said is roughly 75%, that 25%, is that mapped? I mean, can we visualize that, or?
We don't have the latest propagation on it study, but we do know the areas, and there's approximately 10 or 11 areas in the state that historically we've had problems with. And I can verbally tell you where those areas are, if that would be helpful. I don't have a map to share with you this morning, but
Yeah, I don't think we need that this morning, but in the future that might be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We can generate some coverage maps and share with the committee, the group, where those coverage areas are. So, and they're historic areas like Roxbury, for example. Right. So,
do we know if, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if we, so you're talking about the state police network. If we were to add in all of the other entities that do dispatching, do we have like a master combined idea of areas that aren't reached by anybody?
I don't have that. So each of the individual organizations or communities have developed their own radio systems, and they have their own capabilities. And I don't have a composite look at what's available statewide. We're only involved in certain segments of that. That would take some work to pull together. And I would think communities, typically these systems grew up out of means of necessity. They needed a communication system for a fire department. They put up one radio, and then they've either worked along with the one radio system in their community, or they've added to it some more progressive community. So I don't have a complete snapshot of that.
Okay.
In addition to that, we don't have a snapshot of what the total loading capacity is. So when we look at radio systems, we look at the number of concurrent users on the system. We statistically look at the possibility of conflict, multiple people trying to communicate. So when you start looking at a larger group, that all has to be looked at again to see if the radio channels can accommodate it. So that's part of another part of the study package that you would be looking at.
Right.
And then beyond the state police radio system, we also maintain, transportation radio systems for the AOT trucks. We have a system for the fish and wildlife folks, so that these are all independent of the state police radio system. So there's a lot of communication assets in the state. It just depends on how they're looked at and how they could be utilized to maximize the efficiency. And each of those individual systems have their own unique areas where there may be communications problems, and some of them may overlap.
Okay, so we don't, if I were to ask, I think you've kind of already answered this, but if, when we're talking about building out regional centers, in addition to the existing state police centers, we don't know where we would need to put up new towers or new transmitters in order to cover all the dead spots.
That's correct. Okay. And we also do not know the number of channels that we may possibly need to take care of the anticipated call volume on the system.
Okay.
And I think, in the future, if you have a framework of where maybe the centers are, where they would be possibly located, we could look at those geographical regions, assist with that, looking at that to determine, what would possibly be needed in those areas.
Okay. How about, resiliency, the ability to work in Irene or a wildfire, or, do we have backup capability if whatever, Pearson Mountain all of a sudden is in the middle of a wildfire?
We have some resiliency as far as sites that overlap each other, but as far as hardening at the site, so an individual site in a geographical area, we have about a week and a half of propane or gasoline on the sites for generators. We do have some backup radio transmitters up there. We have backup backhaul to the sites. So when Irene came through, we saw some of the cellular systems go down. We did not have any failures during the Irene event in our network. So we tend to build resiliency and routing, multiple routing capabilities into that network. So that's the resiliency we have. And again, sometimes there's overlap in systems. So you talked about Pearson Hill, that covers a certain area. I think you said Pearson. Right. Burke Mountain covers that area. We also have a third site over in that area that provides partial coverage if that was to go down.
Okay. Mark Anderson has his hand up. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, and sorry I'm late. I was in a no coverage area. Terry, good to see you, and
Mark.
I hope you're well. Congratulations on your retirement.
Thank you.
I have a few questions, but I think I'm going to start with the simplest one, since you've been in DPS radio shop for so long, and even after your retirement. If the commissioner walked up to you and said, gut feeling, we need to deliver police, fire, and EMS communication statewide, what's your gut feeling? Can we do it, or do we need to invest a lot?
Well, I think, it would require an investment. I don't know what that number is. I think it would require, a study of some type to determine, what's available, what needs to be adjusted, enhanced, etc. So, we can do it. Again, it's money and it's time. And again, it's like I said a little bit earlier to Paul, or to the committee, excuse me, that, we could look at the individual regions to see what would be needed in those areas and come up with a strategy to do reinforcements. It's pretty typical to what's done in the past when regional dispatch centers or communities have set up dispatch centers. Anything's possible, Mark.
Was that it, Mark?
Yeah,
is
for
he-
now.
Okay.
Okay. No, well, I think Ryan wanted to go.
Yeah. Okay. Brian, go ahead.
Hey, sorry, I'm just as I'm taking minutes, I see a few numbers on here that I do not recognize. I just want to know if those folks can identify themselves so I can document that on the minutes.
Yeah, the one that starts with 1-2 and ends with 1-0. That is Rob Helm from the town of Benson.
I'm sorry, Rob
Helm.
No, the first name is Jack.
I'm sorry, Jack Helm. I was thinking different Helm. I'm sorry, thinking of a different Helm from Rutland County. Jack Helm. I'm sorry.
All right.
Yeah, it's a 207 number.
Yeah, it shows up on my screen with just the first two digits and last two digits. And there was another one.
The 498, Paul, is Karen Carr.
Yeah, there's one that ends with 8-2. That may be just a member of the public, Ryan.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Terry, I guess Mark kind of asked what I was going to ask, just in a different way. I was going to say, if money was no object and we wanted to accomplish what is spelled out in our charge, what are some of the key things that we need to consider when building out this new network of regional dispatch centers? What would be our biggest building blocks that we need to tackle?
Well, I think this call, regional communications capabilities across the state is a challenge, and it would take a lot of money to repair, and it would need to be designed or to be enhanced, and it needs to be designed to meet the business needs of the dispatch configuration. And that would take money and time to do. It's not anything we could do overnight, but it could be a plan put in place to, construct a system of that nature. And I think that's big. Communications is really big, and obviously the piece you're working on, which is the dispatch, is equally as challenging. So, but they go hand in hand. Dispatch and communications go hand in hand.
Mark, did you have something else, or do you still have your hand up?
Oh yes, both. Forgot to take it down. So Terry, I'm a regional dispatch center that is interested in participating in this. What do I need to be planning on proposing in 2 weeks when I submit a grant application?
I only got a small piece of that.
Yeah,
That's
Mark,
Mark.
yeah, I think you're really, really broken. I think you're in a bad spot. But I think his question was, as a regional dispatch center who is thinking of applying for the grant funding that's currently been announced, what does he need to, I think the question was, what does he need to have in his proposal to apply for that?
Yeah, the guidance for the funding, I think, has been published, and that would have to be looked at and addressed. But I do believe that regional dispatch centers are looking for facilities that will work with their surrounding communities. I think that's a general rule, but I would refer to the guidance with the funding.
Tara, I'm not sure if my coverage is any better now. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I can hear you now, Mark.
So more specifically, from a technical perspective, what box do I need to plug into your system to be able to talk on the state system? What kind of equipment should I be planning on in that?
Okay, so currently the state's using an AvTech product, and that product is a centralized or a kind of a cloud-based, premise-based solution, and we support AvTech interfaces. And they are a Motorola-owned company now, so you may see them as either AvTech or Motorola.
Got it. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay. So as we've tried to get our arms and heads around this working group that we all volunteered for and maybe didn't know exactly what we were volunteering for, it's come to light, or we've been reminded of other entities out there, and we're trying to figure out why the legislature saw fit to convene this working group when there's already there's something called the Emergency Communications Advisory Council. Can you tell us what that is and what the role of that entity is? Is it actually in existence? Is there overlap between that body and this body? And what is it?
So there is an executive order to create the group, and it happened just prior to COVID. So the group has not been convened. The members have not been named, and that replaced the broadband working group basically for the FirstNet solution in Vermont,
Okay.
which was tasked with advising the governor on where they should go with FirstNet. And that group advised the governor to participate in the FirstNet program on behalf of the state, and the governor accepted that. And then the group was to replace that group to provide overall guidance on interoperability, communications, and communications. It's really just trying to bring a lot of folks together with a lot of expertise in that area to determine what the roadmap for Vermont should be into the future. So has not met yet.
Okay. When I was still working, there was a thing called the VCOM board. Does that still exist, and what's their role?
Yeah, the VCOM board was sunsetted several years ago.
Okay.
The role of the VCOM was specifically for the VCOM radio system in Vermont, which was the interoperability radio system that does exist today and is in use across the state. And we just, as a part of the radio technology team, we manage that program and ensure that that capability does exist.
And then the last one on my list was there is a statewide communication interoperability plan.
Yeah, so there's a SWIC for the state on the SWIC. So that's the Wireless Interoperability Advisor for Vermont. So kind of a homeland security requirement. And my job is as a SWIC, is to ensure that applications that come to Homeland Security meets the interoperability plan. And for Vermont, it is the VCOM system. And we try to ensure that everybody has those frequencies and are aware of that capability. So that is the interoperability platform that's been designated for Vermont. And that plan is uploaded. It's on our website, and it's uploaded to the Homeland Security Federal Group. And it's periodically updated to reflect the current interoperability status of Vermont.
Okay. So at some point and I don't have good notes, but at some point we have heard the comment that it may have been prior commissioner, but that the resources of the Department of Public Safety could be available to new regional dispatch centers that get stood up in order to help DPS shed some of their current dispatching load. But from what I heard you say earlier, it sounds like we don't know whether or not the existing network has the capacity to handle added centers popping up and using DPS's network.
I mean, yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, in some areas that may work well for the dispatch center. In other areas, it may not be the right solution. You know, again, it really depends on what the framework of Vermont, how the dispatch, consolidated dispatch, or the dispatch solution looks like. And then we would try to bring to the table the Department of Public Safety any communications resource that would assist that organization standing up a center. So that it may work well for someone, and for other people, it may not. Small offices or small areas with, you know, light public safety requirements, lighter users may work well, but in areas that are populated where, like a Rutland, it may not be the right solution for that. So each area is looked at individually.
Okay. Are there other folks with questions for Terry? Yeah, Mark.
What is the what's the availability of the radio network to agencies that don't have P25 compliant radios?
So you're probably referencing the letter that went out that we're currently switching over to P25 digital radio systems. We sent the notice out a few years ago in the effort to ensure that all agencies get P25 radio equipment with the grants that were available. The department maintains the constellation, or will be maintaining the constellation of P25 transmitters and receivers around the state. But as far as subscriber units, mobiles, and portables, it's the responsibility of the agencies that want to access that network to have that.
So if we were to consider fire and EMS agencies that are in any given region where there's not significant VSP dispatching currently, it's likely that their radios will not be compatible.
Well, the P25 is only going to occur in the UHF systems, which is the primary law enforcement across Vermont. Fire and EMS typically, and Mark, I'd have to look at your area, you could tell me, are typically in the VHF range, and we're not planning on changing VHF over to P25. And Mark, if you can still hear me, additionally, the channel 2, which was always considered the interoperability when you get close to the office or car to car, that's not going to go to P25 completely either. So we're going to continue to transition to primary channels.
Great.
As we look at trying to fulfill the charge of this working group, what would you suggest would be our logical steps to take? I mean, we need to, like, as I said at the beginning, I don't know what I don't know. So to try to write this report for the legislature that we're tasked with writing and to accomplish these 4 bullets in the charge, if you were in my shoes, what would where would you start?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think you're, from what I heard, you're doing a great job. But I mean, I think really the landscape of dispatching in Vermont, what is it going to look like? What's the most effective way of doing it? What's the model look like? I think once that's decided, then the technology, that would drive the technology. They go hand in hand, but the first thing that has to be done is, what's the landscape going to look like? And then we can address the technology issues as part of that, but that has to be the first part of it, in my opinion. And you are doing a great job, Paul. The group's doing a great, wonderful job. Thanks for the question.
Mr. Chair, can you take a question from the public?
Sure, I'll take a question from the public since nobody has their hand up.
It's for Terry. Could you describe what chasm is and whether you think that's an inventory tool that would help us make progress on assessing the regional radio systems, whether they need replacement or upgrade and infill? And I just have a comment related to that, is that you're suggesting decide the architecture first and who's going to do what. But I believe many of the potential dispatch sites need to see the economics before they will commit $100,000 in design and consulting to figure out that they're not going to be able to use infrastructure that's there. And then I have a different question about failover and these regional systems failing over to the state microwave and fiber in the event of a mass ice or windstorm.
Okay. So the first question on the chasm tool, that was developed by the federal government several years ago to capture the inventory of all the states to see where, there may be potentially for need if there was an emergency in the area or an event in the area. And Vermont participated in that chasm collection tool, I would say probably 10 years ago. And chasm became very difficult for states and communities to use. So it really kind of got abandoned almost for a while. And then there was some changes made to the program that made it more user-friendly. In some states and areas, I know upstate New York is using it, have elected to use that again. So I would say that tool, from my perspective, is not very effective for Vermont at this point in time, and it has not been kept up. So it's a tool. It's one of many that's out there, but it just hasn't been used extensively here in Vermont and hasn't been maintained. You asked several questions there. What was the second one you wanted an opinion on? Failover?
Failover.
So the state does operate a statewide microwave system. It's a fiber optic microwave radio system that serves most of the state's communication locations. And the state has relied on that system for many years. It's been upgraded. It's very current. It's very robust. And we look forward to the opportunity to helping folks get connected and utilizing that resource. So that is available for failover. And when I say that, it depends on what the failover is. It's a limited bandwidth. It's technical terms. It's a fairly big pipe, but like data going to your computers, the bigger we make it, the more people want. So it's designed for public safety reliability and backup, and we do partner with a lot of public safety agencies to use that asset. And then the third.
The middle question was related to how do we go about inventorying, if we're not going to use chasm, how do we go about inventorying the need for replacement, upgrade, and infill of these regional systems? And should that be done at the state level or at the regional level?
I think that's a kind of a determination on the outcome of this group. It's, I believe, as I said a few minutes ago, is that once the architecture is designed for dispatch, then typically the technology folks come in and say, well, how do you accomplish this? And what are the resources there? And I think you start doing that inventorying at that time. But there's a lot of different ways of getting the job done. So it's just my opinion. And was there another question, Steve, or are we set?
We're set for now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Terry from the group?
I got one real quick one.
Yeah, Lance, go ahead.
Terry, we know through previous meetings, previous other working groups, we relatively identified where we think who is applying for the grant. Obviously, that would be Sheriff Anderson's area, Chief Pete's area in Montpelier expanding out. Orange County is looking to expand a little bit. And Newport City is looking to expand out a little bit, as well as St. Albans. So we feel we have, and Rutland as well, sorry. Out of all of those, in your opinion, what would require the most work to get them up and going as it relates to our infrastructure?
Well, you know, I know Barry Montpelier, I'm meeting with them in a couple of hours in a conference call or Teams meeting. You know, they're working on a solution that they're rebuilding the network, basically doing an overlay network. So it seems like, you know, they're pretty independent and doesn't really require a lot of our assets. Rutland, you know, probably Rutland would, you know, benefit from some assistance to us. And did you say Orange County was doing one?
Yeah, but very minor, just enough to probably expand one desk.
Okay. Yeah, that one, you know, the assets out in Orange County for us are pretty limited. So that might be the biggest challenge.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What
So-
does Wyndham and Bennington counties look like, Terry?
Bennington's, you know, we do have some resources down there. Is that Mark asking that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, there are some resources down there. One of the areas, ironically, Mark, is the New Fane area that we have some challenges in. I know we just transferred that tower to you. But, you know, there are some capabilities down there that we'd be happy to talk to you about utilizing.
Sure. And Mrs. Pelsu is very grateful.
I'm glad. We may need to come back to you to ask us to use that tower we put in.
We'll work it out.
All right.
So this might be a loaded question, but got to ask it anyway. Does it make, and we have this unique opportunity with some money, but does it make sense to start handing out money to, you know, we've got a half a dozen places that have raised their hands and said, yeah, we'd like to do something with that money, but does it make sense to start handing that money out now when we don't know the full picture yet of what we need across the state to fill in all of these gaps? It hasn't been studied to tell us, you know, where we're not able to reach anybody. You know, we're talking about, you named off a handful, Lance named off a handful of places, but anecdotally, we might be able to say, yeah, there's a big need in Orange County or there's a big need in Wyndham County, but until somebody with some credentials does some kind of a dive into that and tells us this is where you should be putting your resources, does it make sense to start handing out money now?
That is a loaded question. You know, really, I think the work of this group should determine, you know, where's the best place to invest the money. You know, you can get a pretty good feel from Mark knows his area, what type of coverage he has down there. You know, the sheriff's down in Rutland has an idea what their coverage is down there and what their needs may be. And I think they probably have presented to this group or to the department what their capabilities are, and we'll work with that to see how we can help make enhancements in those areas for communications. So it's a tough question, Paul.
Okay. I'll just run down my list of notes here. Is there, again, considering we have this unique, you know, we may not get a big chunk of money again for a long time. Is there something that's not currently on the table that should be? You know, is there some new technology, some new emerging thing that that we should be, if now's the time to make improvements, we should make the improvements that we're going to want for the next 25 years? Is there something that we're not currently thinking about?
Well, for a lot of regions and states, they have moved from a conventional radio system where there's a channel assigned for each district or each area, or, you know, so each group, law enforcement operates in one channel, EMS operates in one channel. There's a newer technology, it's not even new, but it's called trunking, where the users share the frequencies and the intelligences in the network to make the most efficient use of the channels. Vermont looked at a trunking system 15 years ago, and it was cost prohibitive at the time. But ideally, the state would, from my perspective, would have had a trunking system that uses the radio channels or the radio spectrum more efficiently. Now, whether or not that's a solution that's affordable in Vermont, I would think that we would be financially challenged to do that, but that would be a better solution in Vermont. If that is off the table, there's some other technologies that may be brought to bear. I'm not sure how effective it would be. I have to look at it based on, where these centers are going to be located. So that's from a radio systems perspective. Dispatch console perspective, the ability to utilize the channels. We're currently using the ABTEC solution, and there's a lot of flexibility in that solution and the ability to allow dispersed users to access the radio channels. So that's really a good technology, a good core technology that I would think we would want to promote, and which I continue to promote across the state to utilize so that we can share the resources. So, for example, if Orange County wanted to be able to talk on a Rutland County channel, a state channel, with this technology installed, they would be able to do that. So it allows a lot of flexibility for the radio resources that are available across the state.
Yeah, and that's when we talked a little earlier about failover capabilities. If if we stand up a dispatch center in Chelsea, and then all of a sudden Chelsea has a propane tanker roll over right in front of the sheriff's office, do they have the ability to flip a switch and send those calls to Newport or to Windham County or to wherever?
Right, and I mean that's redundancy in from an operational standpoint.
Right.
There's redundancy in the system itself. Does one tower overlap another tower? So for us doing the ABTEC solution several years ago, if Williston, for example, would be shut down for some reason, then we can, given if we got the right amount of staff, could dispatch from Westminster. We do it for AOT when the AOT center can't be occupied for whatever reason. They can use a laptop to dispatch over the AOT channel. So we provide a lot of flexibility in that core, and I think it's something that we should utilize whenever possible. Just have the people to do it.
Right. When you when you were talking about the trunking and it being cost prohibitive, is that just upfront cost prohibitive, or is there ongoing costs for that as well?
Well, there's a capital investment of millions of dollars, and then there's ongoing cost after that, like any technology. And as this technology evolves, it becomes more software dependent, and the support for the software is really where you start seeing the incremental increases in total operating costs, OPEX.
Okay.
Chair, could I make one more question about LTE?
Sure.
Terry, the integration at the planning level of shared towers, shared generators, et cetera, to what degree? We know that FirstNet, even when completed, their build out was only going to cover about 75% of the state. So we have dead zones around the state, including where AT&T pretended to put band 14 and didn't. How should this group address or recommend addressing the integrated planning for both broadband cellular, which is becoming more essential for public safety response, and the LMR that we've pretty much only been talking about here today?
Right. So, the LTE solution in Vermont and the next generation of cellular technology is an important tool that we should be using for responses. So like maps and data, etc. The FirstNet solution in Vermont had a commitment to build, I believe it was 27 new towers or 37 new towers, excuse me. And we are getting close to completing that project. But that's not it's really not the destination. The FirstNet program is a reinvestment in the state. So as this technology evolves in Vermont, we'll see more and more coverage. And there's also, the competitive market. We have other carriers in the state that's providing LTE, et cetera. So the integration of the two at the dispatch level is important, because the dispatchers may want to push something to the first responder in the field and back and forth. I'm not saying it's not important. is important, but the growth of that system in Vermont has been slower than anticipated, and the investment in that solution hasn't taken place as quickly as we would hope. So it's growing. It's going to be available. It is available in some areas, but I think Mark was saying he was in a bad cell coverage area on this call this morning. So, I think we all know firsthand what the cell coverage is like, whether you're a Verizon, AT&T, or another customer. But I think that's developing and growing, and we want to utilize that whenever possible. And I think that's just another component that we need to look at for that type of technology. But in the voice dispatch world, the primary solution right now is LMR, land mobile radio, the two-way radio systems.
Okay. Anything else before we let Terry go? Well, thank you, Terry, for your time this morning. I can't promise I won't bug you again.
No worries. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with everyone and see everybody. It's been great. So if anything comes up, I'd be more than happy to provide some input if it would be beneficial to the group.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch. Well,
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Okay. I had actually anticipated that would take longer, that there would be more questions, but so we've got some time. There issues or comments from previous conversations that anybody wants to follow up on, or anything that anybody has for the group?
Paul, I still owe the group a few things, a map that shows the different layers of dispatch and all that. I've had people out on leave the past week, so I haven't gotten that done yet.
Okay.
But hopefully that will be coming before the next meeting.
Okay. Lance, you were, I thought, planning to have some additional conversations with, I forget which sheriff it was over in New Hampshire. Is it Jeff Stiegler? I forget who you're talking to.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I actually met with him a couple hours after last week's meeting. And I brought up some of the questions that the group had. It was actually a very good meeting. One of the things that we really wanted to ask or nail down a little bit was specifically the centers that are around New Hampshire. Did these happen through legislative, or did they just happen organically? The sheriff basically said this was just all organically. They just kind of landed in the laps of the sheriffs because at that time they did have 24/7 dispatch centers, so they just really expanded it. The legislature was not involved in it. The communities got together and said this is kind of what we want. As far as the standard level of service, they basically do what we do here in Vermont. The training that they received is the exact same training that we received or that the dispatchers receive. There is a standard, and I think it's APCO that also oversees it. The training level kind of comes through them. They have a recommended staffing levels that they follow. For some reason, they're not short dispatchers, which is what we're obviously seeing a problem there. I don't want to say there's a reason for that. I'm curious if the regionalized centers is the reason for that. I don't know. Their pay is relatively standard to what we have here in Vermont, but they have a lot of senior dispatchers that have been there for quite some time. There seems to be two levels: brand new people that have been there anywhere between 1 to 3 years, and people who have been there upwards to 30 years. So, and I think we were seeing that before the consolidation of the two dispatchers. We had very high, very low turnover rate at that time. I did ask about the the funding mechanisms, and as I mentioned last week to the group, it was through taxation. The 3 people, each center, which is basically each region within their kind of counties within New Hampshire, 10 out of the 12 counties actually have regionalized centers. Each of those regions or counties has what they call a governance board. They're made up of 3 people that are elected through the counties. They are the ones that meet annually. They look at the data, they look at the calls for service, they look at whatever they have, and they are the ones that come up with the recommended funding costs. And I asked if that is relatively consistent throughout the years, and he said it was. But it's up to that governance board, those 3 people who they call commissioners, to decide really what the cost per call would be. And he says it's relatively stable. They're seeing an increase since obviously like what we're seeing through COVID and everything, but it really is up to that governance board to decide the cost for that. I think it's a very unique model. It makes sense for them. I don't know if it would work here because this project is so new. I'd welcome people's ideas or what their thoughts are about that.
Well, I'm curious. You said that the system that they have, which just kind of occurred organically, but is that to include the governance model that they have? How did they arrive at, 3 people and that they're going to be elected and how they're elected? There's no pressure applied from the state level for them to do this uniformly from region to region.
Right. There was no pressure. I think that also I think the director of the 911 board at the time had a lot to do that. Yeah, I didn't ask the question as far as how did it organically happen. I don't know if maybe one county did it and the rest just followed suit. I can easily call him back and get that answer.
And of course, Jeff's only been there a few years, so he may not know the full history of it. But
right.
Brian?
Sorry about that, Lance. What was the gentleman's name? Because I'm doing again the meetings and I missed his name and position.
Sure, it's Sheriff Jeff Stiegler. Steigler.
And he's in New Hampshire?
Yes, he's in Grafton County.
Yeah, he was the police chief in Bradford, Vermont for a little while.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I did ask his opinion, knowing that, he did work in a relatively rural area here in Vermont, if this was a good way for Vermont to go. And he agreed that it was, just because the continuity of service would be better. And that is that you have people that know the area that are right around the corner, rather than while he was here, he was calling up to Derby. Relative Bradford, Derby, it really isn't that far in the state of Vermont, but it is a distance. It would be different if you're calling from Bradford to Williston, which is a significant difference.
Right, which is the case now.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Just trying to think if I missed anything. I did ask for an approximate value, what someone said. He brought up like Littleton, New Hampshire. Now Littleton is also relatively busy. Their town pays a total of approximately $200,000 a year for their dispatch service.
For all services, police, fire,
All
EMS.
services. All services, yeah.
And that's the only funding they get is from those municipal appropriations, nothing from the state.
Nothing from the state.
Okay. That seems somewhat cost effective.
Yeah, I mean, if you're like Littleton, if you're combining those 3 agencies for a total of $200,000, it really isn't Not that I want to say 200,000 is not a lot of money, but
Right, but for a
Um,
community the size of Littleton,
yeah, that's not bad.
that's not bad. And I forget, we may have talked about this already. I assume they have some kind of I think you did tell us before, there's a formula based on, I forget what. On how they arrive at the assessment for each member municipality.
Yeah, it's based on call volume, case numbers, and I believe police may have a little bit different formula of how they bill, but I believe EMS and fire is just based on call volume.
Yeah, I was doing some searching on the internet and I actually found a old report from Commissioner Sleeper. So that tells you how old the report was. But it talked about the Lamoille County Sheriff's Office, and like Lance, you had described it as being a complicated funding formula. And I don't know if they're still using the same thing, but at the time of that report, which I think was maybe 2004, they were getting their funding half based on the town's grand list and half based on the town's population. So it didn't take into effect call volume at all.
No, and I don't know if people know this, but the reason that formula is so complicated is it came out of a lawsuit. And legislature got intervened, and the lawsuit basically said legislature has to come up with the funding mechanism, which is that formula. So,
but I'm not sure how, so they were, and again, this may have very well have changed, but the formula that I was looking at that was in effect at that time, it was, pick a town, say the town of Cambridge. It looks at Cambridge's grand list as a percentage of the entire county's grand list.
yes.
But how does that work when, for example, Lamoille County Sheriff dispatches for the town of Barry, which is not in Lamoille County? So how do they take Barry Town's grand list and compare it to a percentage of Lamoille County's grand list? I have no idea how Sheriff Marcoux arrives at the amount that he bills us here in Barry Town.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that Cambridge is still, Roger's still using that old formula. I think he's mandated, I believe. I don't know, Barb, do you know if he's still mandated to use that formula?
I didn't know the history you just described, Lance, and I don't know, but we can ask him for an update on the funding mechanisms in Lamoille County if that's helpful.
Yeah, actually, I'm not too far from him. I'm working out of the outpost. Maybe I'll just take a ride around lunchtime and see if he's in his office.
I always have a hard time finding him in the office, but maybe you'll have better luck since you're closer.
I'll call him first.
Yeah.
I would call him first. He's in middle of haying season.
Yeah. Well, not today probably, but. Yeah, Mark.
I haven't dug into it too deeply yet, but when we began having this conversation a year ago, I got Hanover, New Hampshire's formula, which I'm happy to share the slideshow. But my understanding is it was kind of it was a formula similar to Rogers, but it also takes a 3-year average of call volume. So the benefit to towns being if you have an abnormal year with a spike in call volume, you don't see an immediate spike in your assessment. But the second piece of that is that they can project it. And so because of I think it was a 3-year average, they are able to say, okay, 3 years from now, because we had a bad year this year, 3 years from now, we're going to need to allocate this much, and they can plan for it, which, while complicated, I don't think anyone here is afraid of rolling up their sleeves and doing a little work if it treats people right.
Right. It helps smooth out the peaks and the valleys and the cost.
What's a good way to distribute it? Email, chat, pigeon?
Well, if it's something for public consumption, we can put it on our resources page. Or if you want to send it to me, I can distribute it to the group. If it's something we don't want, I guess if it's Hanover's document, I don't know if we should post it publicly without their permission.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the public records. It seems to be that it was a public presentation, but I can ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, because anything that's in the public domain, there's no reason why we shouldn't make it available on our resources page, because there are people with an interest that are following what we talk about. Okay. I have, before I don't want to cut off anybody that might have comments or questions or follow-up from previous meetings. I have, so interrupt me at any time, I guess is my point, but sitting here last night thinking about, okay, if Terry doesn't fill the entire time, what are we going to take up next? And I arrived at, in no particular order, sort of a list of things that either are in my head or things that I think I've heard people say, or just things that randomly popped into my head at midnight last night. And I guess I would just like to get an idea of, are these just my thoughts? Is the group in agreement with these thoughts? And if nobody has anything else, I can sort of run down this list that I put together. If somebody has something else.
I have, Paul, is you and I had talked about inviting Clay Purvis to talk to this group, and Clay Purvis is the Director of Telecommunications at the Public Service Department, to kind of give an overview of the lay of the telecommunications world in Vermont and what his office does and might be able to contribute to this conversation. He did confirm that he can come next week, and so I guess I'm checking with you, Paul, to make sure you want me to send him the invite, and we're ready to go with that.
Yeah, I think there's value to that. Is anybody not? I mean, I don't think it needs to be a very long presentation, but I got a thumbs up from Brian and a head nod from Lance. Is there anybody that doesn't see any value to having Clay come talk to us briefly next week? Well, I guess it remains to be seen how brief it is, but I think the more information we can gather, the better. I feel like as chair, I'm kind of floundering here in that I'm still trying to figure out next steps. So the more information that I can cram into my head, the better.
Okay, I'll forward him the meeting invite then for next week.
Okay. So these things, like I said, they're in no particular order. They're just things that, as I went through my notes from the previous 3 meetings, stuck in my head. And I would just like to sort of find out, is everybody on the same page, or are some of us thinking on different wavelengths? And so I'll just run down my list, and if anybody has strong feelings one way or the other, please let me know. The first thing on my list is that I had sort of phrased this as a working group, are we in agreement that, and then my bullet points, that regional dispatch centers should have uniform protocols like the 911 call taking protocols that currently exist in the PSAPs? Any comment on that? In other words, a call comes into Mark's shop should be handled basically the same way a call coming into Brian's shop or Newport's or Orange County's.
I guess I'll throw out that I don't have an issue with the concept, but that seems to be building in an expectation. It also requires a lot of infrastructure to follow it, not the tower infrastructure, but rather training staff, who's the governing body, et cetera. And those might be tricky wickets to thread. So for those reasons, I might say we recommend that for future study, and let's deal with this project first.
Right, I agree with that. It does add another layer of complexity. I do think it's important, so maybe it can appear on a list as something that, like Mark said, is good to study, or is a should rather than a shalt. Yeah, I agree with the complexity issue, though.
Okay. In a similar vein, that the level of service that can be expected by a user agency should be the same for everyone, whether you're a small volunteer organization or a large municipal agency.
How would you describe level of service?
Well, I would say, not to pick on Brian, but, you know, if it's say Montpelier Police Department is operating a center, you know, if the Worcester Fire Chief calls in, he should get the same response, the same timeliness, the same professionalism, not as the Montpelier Fire Chief. You know, that it shouldn't matter whether you are the agency that's providing the service or the agency that's the customer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's uniqueness in who the customer is. And what I mean by that is law enforcement is going to demand or just require a different
Right.
level of service than
Sure.
dispatching an EMS
Mhm.
to somewhere. But yeah, I think that brings, frankly, professionalism to it, and there should be a standard on it.
What about regional centers, wherever they may be around the state, should all utilize equivalent technology and hardware?
It's a good question for Terry.
Right.
Well, I think they'd almost have to because you're going to need redundancy, you're going to need backup,
Right.
you're going to need, you're going to need, as you said, Paul, if a tanker rolls over in front of the sheriff's department and they're not utilizing the same equipment that, say, VSP is, we're not going to be able to take over them. So.
Totally agree with what Lance said, but we're also going to have to contemplate the currently existing infrastructure that absolutely is not. And then maybe we're talking the 100-year plan of capital replacement. I don't know if it's 100 years, but the very long term, because we are talking tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
So maybe that should be a goal, that there's some continued conversation around as the regional centers come up.
This is sort of similar to a thought that I said before, but the dispatching services should be delivered equitably to all municipalities. In other words, the agency operating the center shouldn't subsidize their own costs at the expense of customer agencies. Whatever the formula is for funding should be applied to everybody. This is a I'm sorry, go ahead.
Advocate on that. How do we deal with areas with some form of disparity? For example, Chittenden County has a higher cost than, say, Essex County. Can we have a formula that factors in the obvious differences there?
Yeah, I mean, whatever the formula is that's arrived at, whether it's, you know, in Lamoille County, it's a combination of grand list and population, or whether it's call volume and population, or but as long as the same formula is applied. And yeah, however we arrive at that formula would need to take into account the wide variety of places around the state. This is something I think that Lance had mentioned from the sheriff in New Hampshire. Dispatching services are best delivered close to home by local personnel versus a dispatch center on the other end of the state. This, I think, is probably me talking. I may not be in agreement with some on the group, but the thought that grant funds should not be awarded for prospective new regional centers until we have a clear picture of what the needs are statewide. You know, are we going to spend money on standing up a center in Newport when we don't know what the needs are in Bennington? Are we going to just take these? Well, it's not we, because we're not the group looking at these applications, but should the department just start handing out grant money as the applications come in when we haven't arrived at, and we're actually a long ways from knowing what the overall needs are statewide? Or should the recommendation be made to put that process on hold until we have the full picture?
I think the only issue with that one is because of the dire situation, the lack of infrastructure, that there should be something built in there that it has an eye on capabilities that will, whatever's built will be able to meet any future capabilities that we know that we can project are going to be needed, whether it's interoperability, continuity of operations, and everything to that effect. So I think that if an agency comes up with a plan that will not only meet currently what they're doing, but also will fit into any growth, then I think that it's something that should be considered. And however the current the grant is written, that it should, those who are going to make that judgment, like people like Lance and Terry, they should be able to know how that system's going to be built out.
Lance, what's the current status of state police dispatch statewide? I mean, I've had nothing push over to me, so to me, I could care less. But to Brian's point, it sounds like that there's a pressure that we're not feeling in Windham County.
Well, I mean, right now we're operating at about, ran the numbers last week. We've got 20 vacancies out of 58, I believe. You know, we're covering it. We've done especially down in our Westminster barracks, we've made a substantial changes down there. We've changed their schedules. We're turning a blind eye to overtime, quite frankly. So we're getting by. Luckily, we're getting applications, but it's like police work. We can get an application now, but we know that person's not going to be sitting at a desk for another 5 months. They're not going to count towards anything. So I think we're taking baby steps forward. I'd love to take bigger steps, but we're kind of stuck in the structure of what dispatching is.
Yeah, I look at the list of, you know, and I know I've said this before, but if you look at the list of who Williston and Westminster are dispatching for, if the goal is to help ease that pressure on VSP dispatch, then, you know, Montpelier, Windham County, those aren't the areas of greatest need. But yet I know those are the areas that are prepared to submit an application for the money.
Yeah, I know. I had a conversation with the Rutland Sheriff last week. He is moving forward. He is applying for the grant. He had some questions that I kind of referred him over to Christian Pedoti at HSI or HSU. And so they are definitely moving forward. I'm sure Bob can probably speak to that better than I can, but Rutland County will be a huge step forward for us if they could slowly start integrating into that. Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just echoing what you just said, you know, we know that we are probably the largest user out there for services from Westminster with the, you know, allied agencies, and we are working to try to put something together. The sheriff has been doing quite a bit of background work. I'm glad you and he have made contact with each other, and you've pointed in a direction as far as getting more information on some of the fund uses and the like to make it work. Again, we're at the point where, sure, we can put in an application, but whether it'll be fleshed out to the point that it needs to be to meet everything, you know, that's going to be a little bit interesting to see, because again, we're kind of doing this without a lot of background staff and the like. And I think the sheriff is doing a great job. We have a local group here, and we meet fairly regularly, so we can talk about these things. And one of the things that came up at our meeting last week, and we actually had a legislator there and a state senator there, is the fact that the money, sorry, I'm in a parking lot, grant application timing is somewhat of an issue because, you know, if, okay, we don't, if we didn't apply now, I think we'd be in really bad stead. But certainly whatever we do is going to require a lot more work.
So did I hear you say that an extension of the deadline would be helpful?
I think it would be. Again, I don't know how everybody else is working on this because we have several places around the state doing it right now. But what are the you know, we come right back to, I think, square one, and I think you and I talked about this, Paul, last week when we were on the phone, is, okay, we're going to do these things, and then what if this committee came up with a whole different standard mechanism, whatever, down the road here as we're meeting our mandate with the legislature? There's just a lot of open questions, I guess, at this point, and how that's all going to sugar up.
I think this legislation, when I read it, it was almost the dumb it down. It's like the chicken and the egg conversation. You know, we're lending out money, yet this group is tasked with how we support it long term, and we're literally giving out $6.5 million. Yet we don't even know how we're going to keep that up.
Right. Well, that's my problem is that we're actively getting ready to hand out this money now, when this working group, granted, I don't have any idea how we're going to really come up with any kind of a report by December 1st at the rate we're going. But even if we do, some of the money will already be in the process of being awarded before we even write our report, which makes, I don't know why that surprises me, because it does involve the legislature, but it makes no sense.
Yeah. And maybe that's a conversation with the commissioner.
Right. Okay. Well, we are at 9:43. Before I know we've already had some public input, but I will formally open it up for public comment in just a minute. Is there anything anybody else wants to bring up before we do that?
I have one thing, and I'm not really sure where it fits in the conversation, but something to consider is, as we were talking about all these different models, you know, what's going on in New Hampshire, what the various funding models and kind of operational models, even within Vermont, it occurred to me that some existing dispatch centers are working fine operationally. Their funding mechanism is working for them. Maybe technology wise, they're operating the way they want to operate. And what should the recommendation from this group be about that? I mean, my thought is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So
yeah, that's a valid question. Do we want to come up with recommendations that only apply to new centers that might stand up, or do we want to try to shoehorn everybody into the same model as eventually? You know,
or maybe there's various ways to meet whatever our recommendation is. Anyway, that was just something that kind of came up in my mind throughout the conversation today.
So Barb, when you say that, do you have like somebody in mind, just as an example? Are you talking about a PSAP, or are you talking about, say, someone like Burlington PD, who is an internal, has all their internal stuff?
Right. Burlington PD is a good example. I mean, I don't know all the details of their operations and all that, but I haven't heard anything coming out of there. Lamoille County Sheriff's Department is another one, from at least what I know, and maybe can get more detail from the sheriff on funding, but that has worked well for Lamoille County for a long, long time. So, and I'm sure there's other examples around the state. I'm naturally drawing a blank right now, but so there are unknown needs around the state. That's one component. There's some places that are working just fine, or at least appear to be on the surface. I haven't heard any mention of the whole Chittenden County initiative. They were working on a regionalized dispatch center, but I haven't heard them come up as part of this conversation. So I don't know where they are in that. So my point is just to consider that some places may be working now fine and equitably in the funding mechanism being applied to everyone, how they provide service to all of their customers, their various agencies and so forth. And I'm just putting out the possibility that there might not be one best model. Maybe there is a variety of models that fit into a best practice or recommendation that we can come up with. Don't ask me what that is, though.
Yeah, I guess I had intended to before now, and I need to have a conversation with Sheriff Marcoux, but as far as I know, they don't have any kind of a governance body, right? It's just the body is the sheriff. It's my understanding.
I believe that's the case.
And,
Yeah.
you know, and one of my concerns with that is that, okay, you say it's worked well for a long time. Well, that's because Roger Marcoux's been the sheriff for a long time.
Right.
If he
Yeah,
retires, somebody new comes in and decides they want to totally change things up, what does that do to their customer municipalities?
Good question. Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody?
I got something just real quick. I think I think that this is a lot for all of us to put our hands around, especially that we may not, especially that we don't lack the technical expertise of Terry LaValle. I think what might benefit us from here is looking at the report that we're going to write as a very high level report that we bring in, that the state look at how do you bring in an expert who's going to, especially with Terry retiring, how do you bring in an expert that we can lay out these different things, that regional centers should have redundancy in operations. Regional centers should be able to meet or to contribute with the existing infrastructure that the state already has. So if we look at those different things, that, you know, we have to have X amount of policies and processes, that we have to have a formula that's based in equity. And then, so if we have those recommendations and then we contract that out, maybe use some of that state funding to contract it out to an organization that we can give that to, and then they can come back with the specificities or consultants. And then we can go from there to design a full plan, rather than us trying to take a bite out of this huge elephant by going down into the weeds like that, because we're most certainly going to miss a whole bunch. But I think that any recommendations we come out with should be putting that in the lap of a consultant or hiring somebody to help us to come in here and do that right, rather than us taking up that mantle.
Yeah, I agree, because I certainly don't feel qualified to write this report that's required by the charge. And I don't even know who I would turn to. So I need a consultant to tell me who to hire for a consultant. Okay, anybody else before I open it up for public comment? If not, is there any public comment that we haven't heard already?
Yeah, I won't repeat what I said already. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Steve Whitaker for the record. With regard to Brian Pete's comment, you don't have the luxury of time. You can't spread 2 years of consulting here, especially when there's momentum to hand out millions of dollars in the next months. So, in fact, handing out millions of dollars without a plan that addresses governance, that addresses radio interoperability, that addresses failover, could be throwing a wrench in the works of what this group is attempting to do. So the legislation requires a plan, but that plan is not specified, and it's primarily to be done by the department. So this group is primarily looking at funding sources, budget, and governance issues. So but what the legislation leaves out is the relationship of LMR and LTE for public safety broadband with priority and preemption, and the capital costs. If you are attempting to achieve the report that was asked for, you've got to get a handle on the capital costs. That means you would need to use some of this general fund money, the $6.5 million that is available this year by vote of the Joint Fiscal Committee, to do that radio assessment that Terry LaValle referred to size up every system and what it's going to cost to upgrade, replace, or infill. You also have the issue of, Barb mentioned Chittenden County. Steve Locke, when he was still fire chief in Burlington, mentioned that they wouldn't be ready until late 2023. And that may be why they're not proposing to put a grant in. He said that at a 911 board meeting. I think he's since moved to South Burlington, which I believe would be the host to that regional dispatch center. But we have a problem that this committee should deal with, which is the size of Shelburne. Shelburne is too big to fail, or too big to fail over to anybody. So either you scale Shelburne down, or you build something equivalent, or you do a any-to-any architecture, which is very expensive, and that if Shelburne were to fail, that dispatch load could be picked up by multiple centers. With 911 calls, that's already the case. With dispatching, it is not. So with regard to standards for dispatching, I think you every dispatch center is going to welcome the funding that comes along with state-funded training and state-funded quality assurance and quality control. Those expenses are way too large for any one regional center to pay for. And if they're not interoperable, we're wrestling, this whole work group was catalyzed due to the staff shortage. So when you talk about staffing shortages, the portability, the ability of a staffer, a trained dispatcher, or 911 call taker to work anywhere in the state and have common protocols and uniform call handling is essential. Staffing is our most precious resource, and it's going to end up being more expensive than the technology over time. So in that regard, both for job security, career advancement, and job portability, especially in a failover situation, uniform standards are essential in my view. So I sent y'all a few minutes ago a map of the Barb, your staff is calling me back right now. I gotta ditch the call. So I just sent you a map that shows that derived from the tables that Barb sent. And you can see the Rutland County in gray, and you can see the Williston in green. Actually, it's not Rutland County. It's the Westminster PSAP is currently dispatching 20-something towns around Rutland County. So Rutland County should be our highest priority for stand-up, not Central Vermont. Central Vermont is trying to scheme a replacement radio system out of this general fund without the governance in place and without any authority or agreement from the currently served towns. Barb, your list also failed to include Capitol Police as being dispatched by Montpelier PD. So the fact that we have to get our governance in place and get these towns to agree that they're willing to forfeit some of their quality of service, while if Montpelier were to take on dispatching for Rutland County or Swanton or Northfield, Berlin, etc., those are going to impact the quality of service we currently have, which is being skated under the radar because of the lack of governance. We've got two cities meeting today with Terry who are actively trying to undermine the regional authority. So I would just urge caution and urge that you use some of this money to use the CHASM tool that Terry referred to and get this statewide inventory done with professional assistance so that we're ready to get decisions with funding out of the legislature in 2023, not 2024. It's too important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Is there any other public comment? Hearing none. Steve did mention one thing that I had on my list is there is, we've got a couple of lists from Barb as far as dispatch agencies and who covers who and who's dispatched by who. And I think Lance had something similar, but there are a handful of agencies that we don't want to forget that are not, they don't appear on anybody's list. Capitol Police is one of them because, they don't respond to 911 calls, so they don't appear on E911's lists. UVM Police is another one. Several of the sheriff's departments, they're active, they do motor vehicle work, they do law enforcement work, but they're not the primary responders to 911 calls, so they don't appear on anybody's lists. And then, of course, we have a whole smattering of part-time police departments and a handful of constables that are not on anybody's list. So we do have a bunch of agencies that we need to not forget about. With that, any last comments from anybody? We will have Clay Purvis from Public Service Department next week. And I guess that's about all I've got.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
I would second.
Okay. Anybody opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody, and see you in a week.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.